So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Janis Bradley. I'm the Director of Communications and Publications at NCRC, but I live in California, so I'm not there with you today. Hope you're having an absolutely fantastic time at Animal Farm this week. I expect that you are. Most people find it a great experience. I'm going to talk to you this afternoon about something that almost all of us in dogs, in whatever function, tend to do without thinking too much about it, which is that we frame many of our discussions about a dog's behavior in light of that dog's breed, or what we think that dog's breed might be, or even what we think some of the ancestors of a mixed breed dog might be. And some time ago, I started to look into whether or not this was actually an approach that held up. Now, I come to this from a dog training background, so I have taught several hundred people who were aspiring to become professional dog trainers, and worked in private behavior consultation myself. So some of my curiosity about this really came from some of my interactions with my own clients. So let me start with a couple of little examples. You have a blank screen here for a reason. So one day I'm working with a client who has a dog who is nervous around strangers and kind of barks at them, and sometimes will even run up and nip a stranger. He hasn't actually really hurt anybody. So we don't have great cause for alarm. And I'm explaining the dog's behavior to the client, and we're working on getting him more comfortable with strangers, and the universe is unfolding as it should. But the client says to me, I've had these dogs all my life. This is the fifth dog I've had of this breed, and this is the only one that's ever acted this way. And I've got a little voice in the back of my head saying to me, well, what did I'm saying all the right things, but I'm thinking to myself, what did you expect? This is what her dog looks like. So I've got a little voice in the back of my head saying, what did you expect? You got a cattle dog. Why would you expect him to like strangers? Why wouldn't you expect him to nip people? And then I get in my car. I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I drive across the bay, and I consult with another client. And this client has a dog that is very, growly and snappy around his food bowl, and other kinds of things. So he'll take like toilet paper and paper towel rolls and sequester them in his bed and threaten anybody who dares to come close to him. And again, we're working on getting him more comfortable, and the universe is unfolding as it should, and he's getting better, and he's getting happier about people messing with his stuff. And this client says basically the same thing to me. She says, I've had these dogs all my life. I've had 4 of them or 6 of them or however many, and this is the first one that's acted like this. And the little voice in the back of my head says to me, well, yeah, that's probably true. This dog is probably the exception. What do you think he looks like? This is what he looks like. This is what her dog looks like. And over the years, I had, more and more of these experiences, and also my general experience working with clients whose dogs were exhibiting behaviors that were problems for the clients. I found over the years that it behooved me to really listen to what the client had to say, and I started to wonder if maybe the clients didn't know a little bit more than I did. Maybe their observations of their dogs weren't just aberrations or anecdotes, and that there was something actually going on here. Maybe my little voice wasn't as accurate as I thought it was, because it was based on the kind of conventional wisdom about breeds and behavior that's common throughout most of the dog-related professions. And it's starting to change just a little bit, but I would say that the kinds of reactions that I had were still pretty typical. So I decided to look into it and really think about this question of the usefulness of thinking about behavior in terms of the breed of the dog. So I started to investigate. And the first thing that I wanted to consider was, why do we do this in the first place? Okay, because these are the things that we typically do, coming from the belief between people both in dog professions and people in general. Everybody seems to share the belief that the breed or the breeds in a puppy's ancestry can be used to predict the personality and behavior of that dog. And so shelters and rescues often label dogs by breed, even if they're mixed breed dogs, which probably about 70% of dogs in shelters specifically are mixed breed dogs. Okay, and then the adopters come along and they make their selections, and shelter people try and make good matches based on assumptions about behavior, again based on breed, even among mixed breed dogs. And this is the one I think that in many ways is the most slippery slope, is a place where some of our biggest problems come in, because an adopter who is usually a person who's pretty naive about dog behavior, is just somebody who wants a dog to be a companion, will often minimize their own responsibility to train the dog, because after all, he's come hardwired with certain kinds of behavior. Or on the opposite, think that there's nothing they can do to change behavior because it's hardwired according to breed. Okay, but this remains the common practice among people and dogs, and I think among people adopting dogs. So the first thing that happens, and many of the software programs in shelters actually demand this, or programs like Pets for Life demand it. One of the first pieces of information that's input about a dog is, what breed do the people think it is? Whether that's a label that comes from the owner who's surrendering the dog, or the people in the shelters who are having to put this kind of label on the dog. Okay, so again, the question is why? Well, why do we do this? First of all, I think we tend to believe that we can make roughly accurate visual identifications of dogs by breed, even if they're mixed breed dogs, that we can make what we think of as an educated guess and be pretty close most of the time. Okay. We believe that behavior is predictable, at least to some extent, according to breed, that dogs of one breed are going to be more likely to behave in a certain way than dogs of another breed. And I think we also tend to believe that what I mean by historical dog type characteristics are the things that people describe as, he's been bred for centuries for this, so that the working dog qualities that were, at least at one time, associated with the selection for a particular breed or type of dog. We assume that is somehow relevant to people who are selecting a dog to be a companion. Okay, if any one of these things turns out to be false, we really don't have any business trying to match-make dogs by breed. The whole house of cards falls down. Okay, and so what's the outcome here? Are any of these things true? Turns out they're really not. None of them. We're wrong on 3 out of 3 here. Okay, which is I think causing very misleading situations for us as dog professionals and for people who are just trying to do the best they can to get a dog that's going to fit into their home. Okay. So people who work in adoption agencies to find homes for, I remember, probably 70% mixed breed dogs in the population, we routinely label them according to what we'll usually call predominant breeds, what we think is the main breed or couple of breeds that we think are in the dog's ancestry. So Dr. Victoria Voith, who's a very, very well-known vet behaviorist, she's been writing about dogs and behavior for a very long time, decided to look into just this question of can we visually identify mixed breed dogs. So she and a group of scientists tried to test whether or not such labels were accurate. They looked at, among others, the 16 dogs that are pictured here. These are a sample. They compared the identifications that the adoption people had put on these dogs when they were sent out for adoption. They compared those to DNA analysis. So these dogs had all been sent out with a predominant breed label. They brought the dogs back, did blood samples, and did DNA analysis. And the bottom line that they found was that for 12, that's more than 80%. Of the 16 dogs that you see here, the agencies, the people who adopted the dogs out, had not identified even one of the breeds that showed up in the DNA analysis. They didn't just miss on predominant breed, what was the dog mostly, they missed altogether. Okay, there was nothing in 12 out of these 16 of the breed that the dog had gone out as. Okay. Now, in all fairness, if I was looking at this group of dogs, there are some of them where I wouldn't even want to make a look-alike guess. They're pretty mixed breed looking dogs, a lot of them. So, I mean, I don't know how many of them that each of you think that you would try and make a guess at, even though all the adoption agencies did, because they felt like they were required to. But there are some among these that I think really do have fairly strong appearance, a visual kind of resemblance to particular breeds. So I wanted to make my mini examples as fair as possible. So I pulled three of the guys out that I think really do resemble particular breeds. And most people, I find, agree that these three guys are ones that you'd probably be willing to venture a guess on. So these are three again out of the 16. So just to keep yourselves honest, I'm going to give you 30 seconds, and why don't you just jot down on a piece of paper what you think the top dog, the dog at the top here, would go out as if you came into your facility, or if you were walking down the lines of a shelter looking for a dog. What would you call the top guy? What would you call the middle guy? What would you call the bottom guy? Just so you have a little bit of investment in the next slides. So we'll take 30 seconds. Okay, the next slide is going to show you what the breed labels were that these dogs were given when they were sent out for adoption. And you'll probably agree that they're pretty plausible. The first dog was sent out as a border collie. The pictures on the right are actually photographs of documented purebred dogs of these breeds, so you can see the resemblance. And typically when I do this presentation, I get more hits on border collie than on anything else, although I do sometimes hear different things. Most commonly some kind of spaniel. Okay. The second one I think has a plausible resemblance to the label that he went out under. He went out under as a Tibetan Terrier, although that always seems a little bit exotic to me. I might go for something a little bit more common. But the guy on the bottom is the slam dunk. Everybody labels this dog a corgi. Most people don't try and go so far as to say which kind of corgi, but almost everybody labels this guy a corgi. So that means that these dogs went out with these identifications, and very likely with some sort of sage and serious advice about how you should live with this dog and what you should expect from him. So depending upon your bias about border collies, for example, the dog at the top may have gone out being told that the dog, he's likely to be great with kids or he's likely to be terrible with kids, depending upon your border collie bias. But almost certainly with very serious talk about this is going to be a really high energy dog. And our corgi on the bottom probably went out with admonishments about him being likely to nip people on the heels and such. Okay, so when we set out when the DNA samples were taken and the results came back, and I'm sure you're ready for it now. This is you know this is going to be different. You've already been warned. Here's what came back on these three guys that actually do bear a pretty strong, I think, morphological, which is a scientific word for appearance, resemblance to the breeds that they were set out as. Okay, so here's our border collie. What we've got here is English Springer Spaniel and German Short-Haired Pointer, both at the grandparent level, which is the 25% level. Nothing else showed up at a significant enough level so that the DNA could capture it at all. So no border collie here. Okay, here's our Tibetan Terrier. Here at the grandparent level, we have Shih Tzu. Okay, so small amount of Shih Tzu, and then at the almost trace level. So this is great grandparent level. We've got Pekingese, which I love here. We've got Cocker Spaniel. We've got miniature Schnauzer. Okay, what's missing, of course, is Tibetan Terrier. And lots of people, in my experience in dogs, think that Tibetan Terriers are difficult with people. Don't like strangers and don't like lots of new people. So that's likely to have had a significant impact on the expectation of those adopters, and also who the adoption people steered toward adopting this dog. Okay, here's what he really is. Okay, now here's our corgi. Okay, we've got, and these are all only at the great-grandparent level, so these are all just traces of DNA. We've got Pomeranian. Here's our Tibetan Terrier. We've got some Shih Tzu here. We've got some Black Russian Terrier. We've got some American Water Spaniel. And in the interest of full disclosure, at the time that this particular panel was run, American Water Spaniel was one where the Mars Wisdom panel, which was the DNA test that was used here, got a significant number of false positives. So maybe there's American Water Spaniel there, and maybe there isn't. Again, the takeaway is, what isn't there? There isn't corgi. Okay, so with regard to mixed breed dogs, this really means we can't be talking about breed at all based on visual identification. Okay, we don't know what the breed is by looking at the dog. Okay, and this is, of course, what Dr. Voigt and her colleagues very reasonably concluded This is the finding statement here, that since 87.5% of the dogs identified by an adoption agency as having specific breeds in their ancestry did not have those breeds detected by DNA analysis at all. So this suggests that it would be worthwhile, and this is a very measured scientific conclusion, that it would be worthwhile to reevaluate the reliability of breed identification. You think? And Dr. Voith and her colleagues have done a follow-up study that found that not only did the breed labels placed on the dogs prior to adoption not hold up to DNA analysis, when she had a variety of professionals, and this was more than 100 dog professionals of various kinds, putting labels on the same group of dogs, they seldom agreed with each other. They were not only wrong, they weren't wrong in the same ways. They didn't agree with each other. This is quite a big deal when you realize that a very large amount of the research that's been done, the findings that have been made and published with regard to behavioral tendency in breeds have been based on, have come from groups of dogs that were identified by their owners as being of a certain breed based on visual identifications that had come to them with the dogs. So that means that any research that's been done in the past that relied on visual identification of breed is completely suspect. Okay, that data, all of that data, we now have to look at pretty much with a grain of salt. Okay, it may explain some things about some of the conflicting findings of some of that research too. It may be that people weren't actually looking at the breeds of dogs that they thought they were looking at, and that led to findings that are all over the map. Okay, so this is very important research when you're talking about any kind of visual breed identification. Now, this really shouldn't surprise us. This shouldn't come as a surprise to us at all. We've known this. We've known that this was likely to be the case for about 60 years, but somehow we just kind of lost track of it. If you've seen the pictures of these pups before, try not to remember what you know about them. These are actually some fairly famous pictures. And think to yourself, these are 4-month-old puppies. They probably weigh, let's see, at 4 months they would have weighed around 15 pounds, probably somewhere between, not 20 pounds, probably about 15 pounds at 4 months, maybe 20. So these are 16-week-old pups. If you saw these pups walking down, if you're walking down the aisles of a shelter, or if you're working in a shelter, filling out the cage card, think about what kind of label you might put on these guys. The most common ones, when I ask this with a live audience, the most common responses I get are things like lab mixes, or sometimes spaniels, sometimes some guesses about hounds. Okay. These are actually puppies that were part of a study that was published in the 1960s based on research that the scientists had been working on for a couple of decades before they actually published. They're from the very famous Scott and Fuller research in the 50s and 60s, okay, resulted in a very well known book that some behaviorists have told me, yes, everyone buys it, but no one actually reads it, which would probably explain a lot. Okay, and here's the answer to why it's so difficult to visually ID mixed breed dogs. And this comes from Scott and Fuller, Genetics and the Social Behavior of the Dog, 1965. There's the dad, there's the mom, there are the pups. Okay, so Scott and Fuller were actually interested in looking at breeds and behavior, but one of the pieces of their experiment was they took bona fide pedigreed dogs and crossbred them to see what would happen. Okay, what their findings really foreshadowed was the genetic understanding that we have now that we can actually look at and analyze DNA, which is, to put it simply, a mixed breed dog is no breed at all. Okay, it doesn't land somewhere halfway in between, like mixing paint in two colors. What you have are dogs with access to all of the genetic material of both of the parents, and in a complete crapshoot, they get a mishmash of 50% of the father's DNA and 50% of the mother's DNA, and there's no way to predict which. So you get puppies that don't look anything like either of the parents. And this is at what's called the F1 level in genetics, and that just means the first generation. So that means this is what the litter of these two dogs looked like, of these two purebred parents. If you go to the F2 litter, the F2 level, which means, again, second generation. So if you took one pup from this litter and then you took a pup from another Basenji Cocker cross litter and you bred them, this is the kind of variety that you get. Okay, now here, so this is a sampling of the F2 puppies, and remember, these puppies are still bona fide, for sure, verifiable 50% Basenji and 50% Cocker, and this is the kind of variety that you get. Okay, these are, again, 4-month-old puppies that could probably go out in almost any shelter in the country, scattered among pretty much any breed that you can think of. Okay, they're about as varied as a group of dogs can be. About the only limitation that you're going to see is that you're probably not going to get dogs that are larger than both of the parents or smaller than both of the parents, and that's about it. That's about as, the parents are going to provide a kind of an envelope of size, and for our purposes, that's about it. So if they vary this much in appearance, obviously, even if there were behavioral traits that were conserved within the original purebred dogs, which is by no means established, but even if there were, you wouldn't expect that to follow along on the mixed breed puppies either. So the big takeaway on this is, when I have a geneticist colleague among our advisors who really has said it better than anyone else I know. He says you must remember that a mixed breed dog is no breed at all. It's meaningless to talk about a mixed breed dog in terms of its breed ancestry. And Caitlin, if she hasn't already, will probably direct you to a wonderful infographic that's on the Animal Farm Foundation site that goes into more detail than I have time for here, that really explains what happens genetically when you have a mixed breed dog. So if she hasn't already shown you that, bug her to direct you to that place on the site, because it makes this very usually technical and difficult genetic theoretical material, I think, extremely, extremely accessible. It's a very, very useful graphic. Okay. So I'm probably starting to sound a little bit, a little bit extreme in light of the things that you've always thought about breeds and behavior here. So I want to back up a little bit and ask some really fundamental questions. And the first one is it possible to breed for specific behaviors, to select the individuals that exhibit the behaviors that you want and breed them to each other and increase the likelihood that you're going to see those behaviors? And of course, the answer is yes. People have been doing this for thousands of years. Absolutely, you can do this. Most successfully and most commonly bred for behaviors are the kinds of behaviors that ethologists, which is the area of animal behavior study that studies animals in their natural environment, that observes their behavior and counts behaviors and figure out what has meaning and what predicts what. That's an ethologist. Ethologists have identified certain kinds of behaviors as what they call action patterns. And these are very simple behaviors that are often legitimately described as hardwired. They pop out. A geneticist would say they're expressed as soon as the dog is exposed to the trigger. It's like clicking on software, like clicking on a software program. And these kinds of behaviors can be increased through selective breeding. Most of them are very, very simple things, and most of them, interestingly in dogs, are actually part of what the wolf ethologists describe and generally carnivore ethologists describe as the predation sequence. So it's one piece of how a carnivore makes its living by chasing prey. And so that might be a stalking behavior like the pointer does, or a tracking behavior like the centhound does, or a chasing behavior like lots and lots of dogs do, maybe greyhounds in particular, or a grab and kill and bring back the food behavior like a retriever does. Absolutely, you can select dogs to increase the likelihood of behaviors like this. Okay, they're very specific, they're very concrete. They require just a trigger to actually occur. Okay. They generally don't have to be learned, although you can train them in dogs that don't. Most of them in dogs that don't have a strong natural inclination to do that. So yes, you can select for very specific behaviors. The question is anybody doing this very much anymore? Okay, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And is it possible that a closed gene pool can develop behavioral commonalities? In other words, can they get more and more alike over time? And by a closed gene pool, what I mean is something like a dog breed, where for whatever reason, with dog breeds, it's because of humans controlling opportunities for reproduction, but there are all kinds of other ways, usually geographic isolation, that closed gene pools occur in nature, which is that no outsiders are allowed into the group. So you have a finite group of animals that are reproducing among themselves, and no outsiders can come in. When this happens over time, there's a phenomenon called genetic drift that occurs, and very, very gradually those groups become more and more alike. Okay, the less genetic diversity there was to start with, so the fewer kind of founding members there were, the more dramatic this effect is. But this has nothing to do with selective breeding. This is a chance phenomenon. It's really a statistically analyzable phenomenon, and undesirable traits are just as likely to increase as any other traits. This is not about breeding for something, but it's a very, very gradual process that occurs when you have one of these closed gene pools where there aren't any outsiders over a period of time. Okay, and then finally, is it possible to breed for kind of big, basic personality traits? And again, the answer is yes, although there's some limits on this. There have been studies that have been done for big traits like being generally fearful in the world, or being generally friendly, or even being generally, not generally hostile, specifically hostile in particular situations. And this has been done with all kinds of species. With fish, there have been lines of stickleback fish, particularly, and it's the kind of the favorite breed for this, that have been bred to be so hostile that where the males are so hostile to other males of the same species that they'll try and attack each other through the glass walls of adjacent fish tanks. Okay. It's been done with rats, very famously with foxes. Some Russian experimenters in Siberia, and those colonies of foxes are still going on, where they selected specifically the ones that were least fearful of humans, and kept raising the bar on that until they developed foxes that were super affiliative with human beings, just act like happy, friendly puppies trying to get at people, and selected in the other direction too for foxes that were extremely fearful of human beings and would cower in the corner of their cages when people approach and attack a hand, a human hand that was inserted into the cage. If you're not familiar with these, it's very, very easy to Google video that shows you these dramatic differeres that they achieved in about 40 generations. So very, very dramatic results. There are a couple of big caveats on this, though. First, the selective pressure to achieve this has to be ruthless. And by ruthless, I mean you've got to breed for this characteristic and nothing else. If you care about anything else, like, for example, how the animals look, you're not going to be very successful. Okay, you've got to breed just for this characteristic and nothing else. And with the Siberian foxes, with the silver foxes, for example, they got various kinds of morphological changes along for the rides. So the ear set changed, and the tail set changed, and the coat color changed, and various other things changed along for the ride when they bred only the friendliest ones, for example. You can't have it both ways. You can't. It's extremely difficult to select for multiple characteristics at the same time, and the success is very much compromised when you try and do that. The other big caveat is that you can breed ruthlessly for something, but if the animal's environment is significantly different, including the in vitro environment, including the environment before the animal is born, a whole lot of that selection goes out the window. Okay? Whether or not a trait actually is expressed often depends upon what the animal's environment is once it's there in the world. Okay. And the other piece of this, I think I'll go ahead and talk about this a little bit now, is that even though these are large personality traits that are being successfully bred for here, when you start talking about breeding for aggression specifically, it immediately gets a whole lot more complicated. And the reason that it gets a whole lot more complicated is that aggression isn't a trait. It's a whole bunch of traits. So aggression in terms of hostility toward members of one's own species. So dogs that don't like other dogs, for example. They are not at any elevated risk to be unfriendly to people. This is true of other species. And predatory aggression, the inclination to chase down and kill members of other species, of lunch species, is not related to either of the other ones. So it's not a generalized thing that you could even theoretically breed for. Not a monolithic trait. It's difficult to overstate what the power of outcrossing is. I hope you're getting an idea of this from the results of the hybridization that Scott and Fuller did. But this holds true in other species too. When you have a closed gene pool, again, you've got that process called genetic drift, which is often unhealthy. Often when you get a very limited gene pool, you start to see animals that have trouble reproducing successfully, for example. But as soon as somebody dips their toe into this gene pool that's an outsider, the whole thing changes. There's a group of isolated wolves in Sweden. This was not a captive pack. This was a wild group of wolves, but they were genetically isolated from other wolves. There hadn't been any outsiders into the group in a number of generations because there wasn't any way for outsiders to get there. It was a geographic isolation. And they were having trouble. The females were having trouble getting pregnant and producing young that could survive to adulthood. So they brought in one outside male, and the problem was solved in one generation. Okay, again, takes us back to our takeaway, which is a mixed breed dog is no breed at all. We just can't talk about it. Hard to let go of. But it really is the scientific fact. But let's say you do. Not happening in very many dog breeds anymore. But let's say that you do decide that you're going to rigorously breed for particular behaviors. So only the dogs that exhibit those behaviors are going to get a chance to reproduce. There are not very many significant populations of domestic dogs anymore where this is the case, if there ever were. But racing greyhounds are still an example of this. Racing greyhounds are bred strictly only for a keen inclination to chase little rapidly retreating things. In this picture, this is the lure that they use on racetracks. The thing that looks like kind of a furry hot dog here is the thing that goes around the track faster than the fastest dog can go, and they chase it. Okay, if they're not keen to do that, if they don't do that just as hard as ever they can, the first time they're exposed to anything rapidly retreating, they don't get a chance to reproduce. Okay, this is what you typically call an evolutionary bottleneck. In other words, no individuals have an opportunity to reproduce if they don't do this. And then the other characteristic, of course, is that they selectively breed the ones that do this the fastest. Okay, the ones that win the races. And the metric by which they do this is they only breed the ones that are successful at racing. So they got to want to do it, and they've got to have the physical ability to do it fast. Any individual who fails to meet either of these criteria is culled from the breeding program. Okay, they never make babies. And this kind of behavior is one of those action patterns that I described earlier. It's a part of that predation sequence. It's the chase piece of the sequence. It doesn't have anything to do with the tracking part or the stalking part or the catching part or the dissecting part or the eating part. Nobody cares about that with racing greyhounds. As a consequence, some of them will actually, chase down little animals and kill them, and some of them won't, even if they're keen for the chase part. It's the breeding. The selection criteria are blind to any of that. So some of the dogs do it and some of the dogs don't. So what happens with this ruthless breeding for behavior among this group of dogs, and there are probably still in the United States maybe 20,000 of these dogs being produced a year. So it's a significant breeding group. What actually happens, even with this selective pressure, is what I can see in my living room right now, which is even with this, 20 to 30% of them, or only 70 or 80% of them actually are keen to chase. 20 to 30% of them wash out because, you know, they're just not that into it. I have in my living room right now 2 greyhounds. This is one of them in his earlier years, and this picture is photoshopped because I didn't want to wait for this to happen in order to get the visual for this. If this were actually to happen, which it sometimes does, this guy's head would explode. Okay, we do frequently have squirrels sitting right outside the living room window, making this guy crazy. He raced until he was 4.5. He was good enough to stay alive and keep racing for that long, although not successful enough to be bred because he only won about 20% of his races. So this particular farm decided not to breed him. On the other hand, on the opposite couch, I have a fawn female who, when this guy is barking his head off at the squirrel outside, looks up and says, "Oh yeah, really, it's a squirrel, whatever." Okay? She's just not that into it. So what you would expect to be a true bottleneck that would get you very close to 100% doesn't achieve that, even with ruthless single trait breeding. But now, you could certainly say you would take the odds of 70 to 80% at the roulette table in Vegas for sure. Seems like a very high probability of behavior. But you have to stop and think about the particular behavior that's being selected for here, which is a keen drive to chase stuff. This is already something that probably, think about your own experience, at least half, maybe 60% of the dogs across the species are already keen to do. So all they've been able to do is bump it up 10 or 15%, even with the most ruthless breeding. And this is not the way that purebred dogs are typically bred, certainly in the United States anymore, and hasn't been the way that the selection criteria that has been imposed on them for well over 100 years, probably 120, 130 years at this point. Because since dog shows began to become popular in the late 19th century, in the 1890s, they started to be fairly well established. And at about the same time, around the turn of the 20th century, they started closing those breeding pools. Okay, saying we can't have any outsiders anymore. This breed is going to be only dogs with this particular ancestry. Purebred dogs have been overwhelmingly selected for the way they look, and the way they look as judged in a dog show ring. I assume, to a large extent, for practical purposes, because what can you judge if you're just looking at stationary or walking and trotting dogs in a breed show ring? You can judge what they look like. You can't really judge what they're able to do, or what that has how much that has in common with some sort of ancestral work. Okay, so what would you expect to have happen? Once the focus shifts to appearance, you would expect to have the behavioral qualities, insofar that there was some probability within that group. Before you changed your criteria, you'd expect it to wobble and drift and generalize to the species norm. And this is what Ray and Lorna Coppinger predicted in their book, which if you haven't read it, should really be a staple of your bookshelf. Everybody in dogs should read this book. It's called Dogs, A Startling New Understanding of Canine Origin, Behavior, and Evolution. It's the strongest current, they put forward the strongest current theory of how dogs evolved to become domesticated and to live with human beings. So it's really important to read for that. What they hypothesized in this book, and they didn't have proof of it at the point that they wrote this, was that in a few generations of selecting for specific size, color, and other superficial reminders of the ancestral working dogs, any of the innate predispositions for the ancestral work almost certainly deteriorate. That's what they expected they would find to have happened in Coppinger. But again, they didn't have objective demonstrations of this at the time that they wrote this book. Okay, but this was the kind of thing that they were seeing. Ray Coppinger is a sled dog enthusiast, for example, and one of the things that he realized in putting together successful sled dog teams was that right away you had to kind of throw appearance out the window. And so here's an example of that. The two dogs on the left are successful Iditarod competitors. So that means that they're competing in the largest sled dog race in the world, which takes place in Alaska every year. The dog on the right is the American Kennel Club ideal of what a Siberian Husky, originally intended to be a sled dog, is supposed to look like. One of the things that's going to jump out at you is that there's not a whole lot of resemblance between them. You'll probably notice that between the two dogs on the left, there's, they do actually kind of look alike. That doesn't necessarily mean that successful sled dogs are going to all look like this. They don't. What it does mean is that you have to match up dogs on a team. They have to have similar conformation in order to work successfully on the same team. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to pull efficiently together. So you can have different sled dog teams that look very different from each other, but few of them are going to look very much like the AKC standard, because this is a breed that's been a closed gene pool competing in a competition based on appearance since previous to 1930. That's a lot of generations. Remember, it only took the Siberian fox people 40 generations to turn a wild animal into a domestic animal. So how much do you think behavior is going to wobble in an animal that's being bred for appearance over a lot more generations than that? Okay, so exactly what you would expect to have happen is pretty much what has happened. Because what is it that pedigree dogs are bred to do? Coppinger, who I think is a little bit ungenerous about that, says that the behavior that the dogs are bred for these days is standing, is looking good standing. I would say they have to do a little bit more than that. They have to trot alongside the handler. They have to walk around. They have to show some docility at some pretty invasive handling. If you've watched what the judges do with dogs in a dog show ring, it's pretty invasive handling from the perspective of most dogs. Although if you watch carefully, you'll also notice that a lot of those handlers are doing their best all the way to the point of holding the dog's noses, holding the dog's mouths closed to keep them from biting, to make sure they don't bite or snap at the judges when they're being handled. But this is what Coppinger says they're bred to do, which has nothing at all to do with what earlier versions of dogs that might have looked something like this were bred to do. And so a Swedish scientist decided to take a look at this a few years ago and said, okay, if I look at a bunch of breeds and group those breeds according to their functional groups, and by functional groups I mean the groups in which purebred dogs are usually classified. So and these were the European groups that are slightly different than the American groups, but they're similar. So there'll be a terrier group. and there are certain behavioral attributes that are ascribed to terriers, as having had a history of searching out and getting rid of what were termed vermin species like rodents and such. There will be a herding group. There will be a guarding, or in the United States it's often called the working group. So he took 31 breeds, distributed them among the groups where they were classified, and then tested them on various personality traits defined as things like playfulness and sociability and curiosity and fearlessness, and looked to see if they had anything in common according to which group they came from, if there were behavioral commonalities according to that. And the answer was a resounding no. So a dog from a terrier breed was no more or less likely to be sociable than a dog from a herding breed, and so on and so forth. They didn't have those kinds of characteristics in common. He did find some commonalities, some commonalities within animals, within dogs in specific breeds, but he also found the full range of behavior in every breed. Okay, and these were dogs that were in fact, bona fide pedigreed dogs, although they were all European dogs. So we can't assume that they would be genetically, they've been genetically separated pretty much from the American versions of these breeds for quite a long time, although there is some crossbreeding. So sometimes American breeders bring over European dogs and vice versa. But he found just exactly what Coppinger predicted that he would find, which was that doesn't hold up. They no longer exhibit any traditional commonalities based on characteristics that they were bred for originally. Here's the question that everybody wants an answer to. It's what about aggression? Is there have certainly been some studies that have put out findings that they thought documented some differences among breeds. The problem is those differences are always slight, and they vary from study to study. So one study will find that dachshunds are the most aggressive, and another study will find that chow chows are the most aggressive. Usually what it means when this happens in science is that there's some problem with the methodology, with how they're defining the terms, or there's a problem with the data. And in this case, with various studies of aggression in domestic dogs, it's probably both. Because some of them rely on unverified identification of the breeds, so that data you've got to throw out altogether. And others rely on unreliable assessments of the behavior itself. So you might have an on-site behavior test that doesn't match up with owner surveys, and so on. Okay. The only finding across these various studies that's been replicated pretty consistently with regard to aggression is that they tend to generally find more growling, snarling, snapping, biting behavior toward humans among small dogs, defined as dogs under about 35 pounds, than among larger dogs. But even that is up for grabs in terms of a genetic correlation, because it may just be that people are more likely to keep a small dog around that growls and barks and bites and snaps and snarls and bites than a big dog that does the same thing. So even that finding may or may not be real. And there's also some evidence that people live a bit differently, interact a bit differently with small dogs with small pet dogs than they do with larger ones. So even there, we've got the best evidence. It's still not very convincing. So again, some researchers in this case in Belgium decided to look at the question from the perspective of behavior exhibited in a behavior exam, and this was in a place where a bunch of breeds had been legally identified as more dangerous than other breeds. So they submitted a group of dogs from these identified dangerous breeds to the same behavior evaluation that they had data on from a control group of golden retrievers, and what they found was no difference. No difference in what they described as inappropriate aggression toward human beings. Okay, meaning unprovoked by really outlandish behavior on the part of the human beings. I would have to say that my own impression in the United States is that we have an even higher bar here for behavior for pet dogs that is often one that's pretty unrealistic. I think often for some reason we've evolved to have an attitude in the United States that a domestic dog, that a pet dog should never growl or snarl or snap. Okay, this is comparable to expecting a human being to go through his or her entire life without ever yelling at anybody. It's probably unrealistic. So we tend to conflate warning signals with dangerousness, which is not really a valid comparison. So some of the more reasonable of these researchers have finally concluded that there's so much within breed variation that it's really not appropriate to try and make predictions about a particular dog's propensity for aggressive behavior based solely on its breed. In other words, you just can't get information about a dog's breed, even a purebred dog, and based on that, be able to say that he's more likely to greet you like the dog in the top picture or the dog in the bottom picture. Okay? You just can't know. Okay? You could theoretically breed dogs to be extremely affiliative toward human beings, or to be extremely fearful and therefore unfriendly toward human beings. But again, you'd have to do it like they did with the silver foxes, and not care about anything else. Nobody, to my knowledge, in dog breeding is doing this. This just isn't how dogs are selected. Oops. Okay, and moreover, if what we're finding, what geneticists are now thinking is most likely in the genetic research on aggressive behavior and sort of large personality traits, is that even if we do find some genetic markers down the road, and we're nowhere close to this at this point, we're probably going to find that traits like this, that big personality traits, not those little action patterns, not those little very specific responses that are responses to a trigger, but big personality traits, we're probably going to find that they're polygenetic, which means that there are a whole bunch of genetic information from different parts of the genome that go into this, that have to combine together to give you a certain result, and that isolated human populations don't show any increased inclination to show this, and dog breeds probably aren't going to show it either. Because they haven't been selected for it, and because these kind of traits are just too complicated. And this is what the best thinking, the best, most current thinking in genetics related to domestic dogs is saying now that even when we find some genetic indicators that show probability for one kind of hostile behavior, like hostility toward unfamiliar humans, or hostility toward familiar humans, or hostility toward other dogs, or inclinations to be predatory. Even if we find genetic markers for those kinds of behaviors, we're probably not going to find them within the closed gene pools that are breeds, because there's been no selection pressure there. But let's say that purebred dogs were still being selected for the specific traits, the specific kinds of jobs that were valued in domestic dogs historically, before the advent of dog shows, of kind of, beauty contest selection. And let's say that we still did have increased probability of those kinds of behaviors in domestic dogs in the United States and other countries where they breed for purebred dogs. Would it matter to people looking for a pet dog? Okay, you have to go back to what dogs were typically bred for. You had sight hounds like the Salukis at the top here that were bred to chase by sight pretty independently prey animals over a large distance. There were dogs that were bred to be working dogs, to do things like pull carts around. There are obviously retrievers. There were dogs that were bred to chase large animals and nip at them and move them around in certain directions. There are even dogs that are bred to bond easily to other domestic animals like sheep and then be protective toward them. Dogs that were bred to be predatory in groups, like beagles and foxhounds. Even if those traits were still carrying through, would they have much to do with what pet dog owners are looking for? Because after all, the job of most domestic dogs, certainly in the United States, is to be companions to people. My dog's job is to make my life happier than it would be without them. Okay? None of these kinds of abilities have much to do with that. Because think about what kinds of behaviors that pet dog guardians typically want. They're looking for a dog that's going to hang out and chill out with them. Okay, not a lot of heavy-duty active work. They're looking for a dog that's going to be really affiliated with human beings often, and particularly with children. Some people are looking for a dog that will want to play active games with them, so we'll want to play fetch and jog with them and do things like that. Some people are looking for dogs that are going to be really friendly with other dogs. They're going to play well with other dogs, and even more sort of far afield from those original working dog behaviors, people are often looking for dogs that are going to be easy to get to, often with no training at all, to walk on a loose leash, or to sit quietly and pay attention to the owner even when attractive stuff is going by, or to be easy to house train, or, and I think this is probably the most difficult at all, to do well with long stretches of time in the day spent alone with nothing to do. Okay, to be able to behave like this guy in the lower left, being left alone being all by himself for long periods of the day with not much stimulation. None of these things has much to do with those historical behaviors. So even if dogs were being bred for those things, which they very seldom are, it wouldn't make that much difference. So what are we supposed to do? How are we supposed to help people, matchmake people to appropriate dogs and help facilitate successful relationships? Here's the good news. Okay. It depends more upon how people live with the dogs, how people choose to live with their dogs, than any inherent personality traits in the dog himself, whether or not that relationship is going to be successful. This has been a huge finding that's happened from a couple of directions. As it's become fashionable again to study the behavior of domestic dogs, there was a long period of time when scientists just weren't interested in studying domestic dogs. That's all changed in the last 15 years or so, and now there's so much research about domestic dog behavior that you can't keep up with it all. But one of the very big findings is this one, which is that dogs who live in the home as part of the family, so they have daily opportunities for positive, humane interactions with people. Those dogs are more bonded to their people. They stay closer to their people. They look to people for clues on what to do when in doubt. This is the definition for most people of a good companion dog. So helping people simply to find ways to integrate the dog as fully as possible into their household life is the best predictor of success in that relationship. It's the thing that's going to make the most difference. This is why I can live with rescued racing greyhounds who lived into full adulthood with the most in pretty much the most socially impoverished situation you can imagine. Okay, warehoused in a big facility where one person was taking care of more than 100 dogs. Okay, and those dogs had no interaction. They had no interaction with people except for somebody coming by, throwing them some food once or twice a day, and turning them out in huge groups to eliminate about 3 times a day, and once a week or so going out to race. And yet, these dogs come out of those situations. You put them in a normal home environment with opportunities for positive, humane interactions with people, and in a few weeks, they turn into normal family dogs. It's amazing. This is what dogs as a species are genetically prepared to do, is bond with human beings, probably more so than any other species. They're genetically prepared to do this. Okay? And happily, they're with us, human beings, another species that's hardwired to kind of love the one you're with. So once we're around a dog, we tend to bond with them. Not every person and every dog in every case, but the more opportunities there are for that bond to happen, the more likely it is to happen. Okay, so what we need to do to help people is to focus on how to live with dogs, not which breed is going to be the best match for them. Now, this is not to say that I think we should try and steer people in any particular direction. I think people should be, it's a perfectly reasonable freedom to expect, to say, I can have the kind of dog that I want to have. That's fine. Greyhounds appeal to me visually, so that I have them. They're the dogs that I choose to live with, as long as that doesn't spill over into expectations about how those dogs are going to behave. And those expectations tend to be particularly dramatic when you're matching up purebred dogs with people, because most people who are involved with a particular breed will tell you something like, or almost usually exactly this. Almost everybody who fancies a particular breed will say to you, they're not like other dogs. Certainly the Greyhound people say this. Every breed fancy person I know will say something like this. Now I've had, I don't know, 30 or 40 foster Greyhounds right off the track through my house with all of my Greyhound friends who I love dearly telling me they're really not like other dogs. I gotta tell you, they just seem like dogs to me with the normal across the species range of behavior. I can't say that they have much in common, except that almost all of them are well habituated to being in a crate, so it's fairly easy to house train them. But even that, there are some exceptions. But that doesn't have anything to do with their genetic background. They've just lived in crates most of their lives, so they've had to get used to it in order to survive. Okay, and the way that, remember I said humans are the love the one you're with species. There's actually been some work done on this showing that if the dog lives as part of the family, is well integrated into the household, the owner is more likely to perceive that dog positively on everything from perceiving the dog as having a lower level of aggression than a dog that lives just resident on the property and doesn't interact with people much, to simply thinking that the dog is smarter and more trainable, depending upon how the dog lives. It's the single most important variable in the relationships. So shelters are certainly in a fairly unique position to matchmake according to what people, at least on the Hearts Company's survey report showed, on the basis of what people truly value, which is the personality of the particular dog. So if you have a dog in your care for a period of time, if you're fostering dogs, if you're in a shelter, and you're looking to matchmake that dog, you actually have some information about what that dog's personality is like, particularly if the dog is living in a home in a foster situation. But even in shelters, you can often get some kind of take on what the dog's personality is like. So you can then help guide adopters toward a dog that has the kind of energy level that they're looking for, or that is super outgoing and super friendly, or who is quieter and more laid back. You're going to have some information about this. And in this same survey, which is probably the respondents on the survey were at the more involved end of pet guardians, but these people said that the breed of the dog was a very small factor, which is not to say that people don't choose by breed. Of course they do. And I would say, again, to the extent that choice is based on appearance, I think it's benign. I think people should be able to choose the look that they like. It becomes problematic if they think that breed carries a likelihood of a certain kind of behavior. We need to help talk people back from that. The dog's behavior history, whether it's short-term observation in an interim facility or information from the previous home, is far and away the best predictor of that dog's future behavior if the environment is going to be similar. So I wouldn't have expected my dogs to have behaved the same way when they were living at the track in those under those awful conditions than they began to behave once they were in my home, for example. Okay, but if a dog is going from one reasonable home to another reasonable home, you would expect it to behave similarly. And even a dog that is fearful and therefore hostile when it's been abused, this can often be reversed simply by being kind to the dog. Okay, good husbandry, by which I mean socializing the dog, exposing it to lots of lots of social stimuli, lots of people in different demographics, and treating it and treating the dog non-violently. So not using force to persuade the dog to do things are the best precursors to friendly behavior. And we're now accumulating more and more evidence that the more force you use in trying to persuade a dog to do something, the more likely it is to growl and snarl and snap and bite you, which shouldn't be surprising to anyone. Family dogs, as I said, have been shown to be more socially dependent than our resident dogs, but the good news on this is that you can turn one of these independent resident dogs into a family dog just by integrating it into a family. Dogs are programmed to respond this way. Okay. The only useful genetic predictors you're going to have of behavior are the behavior of the parents and the litter mates, and that's only going to hold up if those dogs lived in a similar environment than the one that you're going to provide. Okay, that is not my, oh, there's my cursor. Okay, so a little summing up here. If we're trying to do matchmaking or selecting dogs by breed, it really amounts to false advertising. If, on the other hand, if you look at the actual dog and his behavior, people are going to have a much more realistic expectation. Okay, if you're going to wind up with dissatisfied customers unless their expectation completely trumps what they actually see. If people make decisions based on breed, okay, much better to matchmake based on personality. You're going to be people's unrealistic expectations of behavior, and therefore their disappointment in the dog are going to be exacerbated if they have expectations based on breed. On the other hand, if they see breed as neutral to behavior, they're going to have an increased sense of responsibility for the dog's behavior. They're going to see that much of it springs from their own behavior. And in the worst case scenario, breed-based selection leads to a death sentence for some dogs. Behavior-based selection leads to fewer returns and more lives that are actually saved. We're doing our jobs better in that rehoming function. So you can reframe the conversation with adopters. You can, they can have, it's perfectly reasonable for them to have sort of, physical requirements. So maybe they want a large dog, maybe they want a small dog, maybe they want a dog with a short coat, maybe they want a dog with a long coat. People should be free to have those kinds of preferences, but ID your dogs, their behavior according to what you've seen, to descriptions of what you've seen that the dogs like to do, what kinds of things you've seen that seem to worry them, and then matchmake according to what the adopters say they're actually looking for. Okay, and the takeaway here is, if you can remember this, you're not going to go very far wrong. There's no substitute for remembering that all dogs are individuals, and there's no substitute for looking at the dog in front of you. There just isn't a shortcut. It'd be nice if there were, but there is no shortcut. Okay. Do we have a way to facilitate questions here, Caitlin, if anybody's got questions?
Yep, they can ask you questions. If anybody has questions, go ahead. Anybody?
It's very comprehensive.
I know it's a lot of material.
I think we're good, Janis.
Okay. Okay. Have a great rest of your internship there.
Thank you. Right.